Welcome to our roundtable. I'm Leslie Vinjamori. I direct the U.S. and Americas program here at Chatham House. It's really wonderful to see so many people on the call for our discussion of the future of the Republican Party after Trump. Perhaps that's a hypothesis, the after Trump part, but we shall see. We have two really tremendous speakers today. You will, I'm sure, know them and know their work. And I'm very, very grateful that they're taking the time to have this conversation. And it's very timely. As we know, Donald Trump made his first big speech since the election just this past weekend at the Conservative Conference in Florida. But I think today's conversation will be interesting because, of course, we have two deep thinkers, scholars who have written on questions of US politics for many, many years in various venues. We have Professor Theda Skocpol and Professor Nicholas Lemon. Let me say just a word about each of them, but let me also say that we are on the record today, and we really do hope that you will ask your questions. They will be recorded, so please be aware of that. We're not under the Chatham House rule, and we'll likely share the recording of this because it is such a timely discussion with two such distinguished speakers. Professor Theda Skocpol has written on questions of the state, on social revolutions, on American politics, US democracy for many years. Many of us, anybody who studied political science, began with her first book, States and Social Revolutions, in 1979. She has, of course, become very well known over the past 8 or 9 years for her work on the Tea Party and conservatism in America. In 2012, she published The Tea Party and the Remaking of Republican Conservatism. And more recently, with colleagues, she published Upending American Politics. So she continues to do deep empirical research on this. She is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of Government and Sociology at Harvard. And she is also founder and director of the Scholars Strategy Network. I also really love an interview that was done with her that just gives you a very full picture of her life and career. And I've tweeted it recently if you'd like to take a look. Let me also say, briefly introduce Professor Nicholas Lemon to you so that I don't have to interrupt you in between their remarks. Nicholas is the Joseph Pulitzer II and Edith Pulitzer Moore Professor of Journalism at Columbia University, where he is also Dean Emeritus. He was Dean of the Graduate School of Journalism from 2003 to 2013 and has had a long and distinguished career before that and until the current moment as a journalist, working, I think, first in New Orleans, later, of course, with the Washington Post, the Atlantic Monthly, and the New Yorker, where he is still a columnist. And most recently, he wrote the book Transaction Man, The Rise of the Deal and the Decline of the American Dream. So it's hard to think of two better placed individuals to give us their current and also their very deep thinking about American politics and the future of the Republican Party. So let me turn it over straight to you, Professor Skocpol, to get us started. And we look forward to hearing from you.
Well, it's a pleasure to be here with all of you today to talk about an important topic, the future, and I'll talk about also a little bit about the recent past of the Republican Party in the United States. And I look forward to the discussion, so I'll try to keep my opening remarks fairly succinct. You know, I think if we read the newspapers or watch the media these days, we see quite a lot about the clash between Mitch McConnell, the former majority leader, now minority leader of the US Senate, who after Donald Trump's second impeachment trial gave a speech that could well have justified a conviction vote in that he blamed the president, a former president, correctly for the inciting the shocking attack by protesters and violence-prone militias on the US Capitol on January 6th, the day that it was set to certify now President Biden's victory, a fairly substantial victory in the 2020 November election. We see a lot about the clash between that savvy former majority leader of the Senate, who in many ways is responsible for blocking most of the Democratic initiatives over the past 8 years and enabling Donald Trump to have whatever policy achievements he did, cutting taxes for the wealthy and stocking the US courts in a way that will last for decades with ultra-conservative judges. He seems at odds with a former president who still refuses to this moment to accept that he lost the election and claims that it was a fraud, and that he will keep going a popular movement that is dedicated to remaking America in an increasingly authoritarian direction. I want to talk about the deeper forces that lie behind this clash and suggest why it's not so much of a clash. That in many ways, the Republican Party has leaned very heavily in the direction of Trumpism. We know at this point that 2/3 of Republican voters still say that the 2020 election results were fraudulent, that votes that put Joe Biden and Kamala Harris over the top are fraudulently registered through illegitimate methods that expanded access to the ballot box in a pandemic, or that they are fraudulently counted. There is some new research on those conservatives and Republicans who explicitly claim to be part of the Making America Great movement. That would be the roughly 50 to 60% or even more of Republican voters who are more enthusiastic about Donald Trump than they are about the Republican Party. That new study by Rachel Blum and Christopher Parker finds that half or more of them endorse the idea that Trump should not only have been installed again in the presidency, but should have a third term, which means they are abandoning the idea of electoral democracy in the United States. And they do not blame Trump supporters for the riots or other violence that has broken out recently. They tend to claim that it's the work of the left, which is a way of deflecting violence, and at the same time pointing to what, in the eyes of many conservative, they're not radical Republicans actually, and Trump supporters are, that's a way of deflecting any kind of blame for change in America onto opponents that they feel justify their own all-out turn to stretching the rules and now engaging in violence and threats of violence. This is a very alarming turn, frankly, because the US has two major parties. The Republican Party label and institutional structure remains capable of claiming electoral victories in 2022, 2024, and beyond, which may once again install a president and one or both houses of the Congress and put them in a position to carry through an outright authoritarian takeover of the US political system. That's because the US system gives great advantages to those who can organize across large stretches of non-metropolitan territory in both the Electoral College that decides who is president, and the Senate that decides much of what can be enacted at all for the US government to deal with the full range of pressing issues that most Americans want dealt with: the pandemic, economic inequalities and suffering at the bottom, climate crisis and beyond. So let me just say quickly that this current turn of events, in which one of two major US political parties and the one that has built-in advantages is turning toward authoritarianism and tolerance of violence and threats of violence, is the result of a radicalization that's been going on from above and from below in the Republican Party for about 20 years or more. The first thrust of that radicalization was a capture of Republican office holders and candidates by ultra free market oriented millionaires and billionaires, particularly those organized through the political machine that is called the Koch network, but others as well. That unfolded, and my colleagues and I have done research on it especially from 2004 on, and was already capturing much of the elite class in and around the Republican Party before Barack Obama became president, and intensified after that. The goals of that extra party political machine that gradually changed the agendas that elected office holders in the Republican Party at the state and national level were prepared to pursue. That agenda is to eviscerate government as an effective agent of redistribution and creation of opportunity and security for the majority, to block any governmental responses to the climate crisis, and to cut taxes and regulations on the rich and the wealthy. The only problem with that form of radicalization in the Republican Party is that it made it unpopular even with its own mass voters. The second wave of radicalization unfolded from 2009 on with the eruption of the Tea Party. And although many outlets like the New York Times portrayed the Tea Party as an extension of free market conservatism by putting on television people like Dick Armey or Paul Ryan to say that it was all about cutting Social Security and Medicare, cutting the budget, removing taxes and regulations, that was at most a surface phenomena of the Tea Party. At the grassroots, where some 2,000 local Tea Parties were spontaneously formed by middle-class conservative-minded Americans all over the country, the top passions, the top concerns were opposition to immigration, particularly from Central America and Mexico, but also Asia and Africa, at a time when the United States was at the tail end of a period of rapid new immigration since 1965. And of course, anger and fear at the ascension of an African-American president with a foreign father who was adored by many young people. This was in many ways a popular reaction to social and cultural changes that are occurring, also nourished by a particularly virulent form of Christian nationalism, which most recent research shows us is not really Christianity. It's not the same thing as conservative Christianity. It's a blend of Christian symbolism and aggressive defensive nationalism in the current period. So that was the Tea Party, and it set in motion a series of changes that began to favor the election of Republicans, first to the House of Representatives, then to the Senate, and ultimately Donald Trump, who believe in an aggressive, no compromise, and increasingly authoritarian form of politics in the name of saving America. Saving America really from the rising new demographic groups and liberals who are elected, particularly in the coastal states and metropolitan centers. That movement would never have gotten further than transforming a large part of the US Congress into a no compromise, deadlocked body had not Donald Trump appeared. But Donald Trump provided the nationalization and the unity that the Tea Party at the base had not been able to provide earlier. And by now, it's a much broader group of Republican identifiers and conservatives to their right who have bought into his authoritarian and I would argue ethno-nationalist centered style of radicalization. So I'll stop there except to say that this synthesis, which came together under Donald Trump's presidency, he offered something to both the ultra-free market elite takeover of the Republican Party and the ethno-nationalist populists. He offered tax cuts to the former and judges, and he offered angry, aggressive, anti-liberal, and anti-immigrant politics to the latter. That synthesis is still there, no matter what happens to Donald Trump himself personally over the next 2 to 4 years, because there are many signs that both wings of this radicalization of the Republican Party are prepared to give the effort to rule through minority elections, the election of people to office with a minority of voters, another horror or two. And the clearest sign of that is that the Mitch McConnell types and the Donald Trump types are completely unified on the idea of enacting a series of additional, increasingly draconian voter exclusion measures that are now sweeping through the US states and blocking any effort by the Biden administration to counter those through the federal government. So we're going to see another effort, as we've seen again and again, to exclude Democratic voting constituencies from any access to the ballot box or to having their votes fairly counted. And there's no reason to believe that it might not work. It could work. And we'll see in 2022 and 2024.
Professor Scotchpole, thank you. Let me ask you one brief question before I turn to Nicholas Lemon. A recent Gallup poll suggested that half of Americans now identify as independents. Does it matter? Is there an argument to be made that yes, the Republican Party has gone in the direction that you've depicted, but it is shrinking in its size and perhaps in its impact?
Well, there are a lot of people who are now registering or re-registering as independents. They do matter in certain primary elections, which could affect Republicans in those cases. But, you know, when it comes right down to it, when you get to the general election, it's Democrats versus Republicans. And a large number of people who are Republican-leaning independents tend to vote for those Republicans in the end. In this election, many of them voted for Joe Biden and either didn't vote at all down ballot or voted for Republicans down ballot. Does it matter? Yes, but it still matters that the levers of getting people onto the ballot and through primary elections are in the hands of an increasingly radicalized Republican Party, where both state parties and primary voters are going to install more extreme people, not less extreme people. So the big dilemma will be, can they squeak through the general election after nominating very extreme people? I think it's touch and go. I'm not in the business of telling you exactly how it'll turn out, but it's a lot closer call than you would think it should be if you just looked at opinion polls or you just tallied up voters.
I'm sure we will have a lot of questions for you. I certainly do. Let's turn to you, Nicholas Lemon. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. And I'll just pick up on some of these themes. You know, stating the obvious, the US has a very, very stable two-party system. It's had the same major two parties in national elections for 160 years, despite many predictions of the demise of one or the other and quite a few attempts to start third parties. So that's point number one. I agree with what Professor Scotchpole just said about, and on election day, it's going to be Democrats and Republicans. Who's in the parties, and this goes along with their stability, the composition of each party has changed a lot over the years. The biggest change in my lifetime is the white South switching its loyalty very dramatically from the Democratic Party to the Republican Party. And that's, you know, powering a lot of the changes that we've just been talking about. But it's useful to understand American politics as a competition between two parties who are constantly trying to steal groups from each other. I worry about Democrats taking the data that Professor Skocpol has just created and using it to become complacent. And the complacency would be along the lines of, one, demographics and numbers are on our side. So ultimately, the Republican Party is a kind of dying remnant that's confined to left behind declining rural areas. Number two, that the increasing minority population of the country cuts against the Republicans. And number three, that Donald Trump personally kind of owns the Republican Party, at least for the foreseeable future, something you saw in the press a lot after the Conservative Political Action Committee meeting of over the weekend. You know, a lesson that I've learned from Professor Skocpol, and that was sort of implied but not directly stated, but I'll directly state it and hope you'll agree, is that organizing really, really matters in politics. Face-to-face organizing really matters. In our lifetime, you know, we've seen the rise of first television, then the internet, public opinion polling, all these things that lead you, if you're observing politics, to think politics is about messaging and manipulation of public opinion. And I think that liberals and Democrats are particularly drawn to this because, you know, that this, it's sort of the world they inhabit. And that over a couple of generations, the Republicans have just out-organized the Democrats, and that's a big source of strength for them. They work much, much harder at in state legislative elections, for example, not just in rural areas, and through religious organizations, a whole bunch of different ways. So I wouldn't count the Republican Party out. Arguably, in the 2020 election, the Republican Party outperformed President Trump and did better down ballot than President Trump did. And it put in a very strong showing in these state and local elections that people don't pay attention to. I believe Professor Skocpol grew up in the legendary Macomb County, Michigan. Is that right?
Nearby.
Nearby.
Yeah,
So the reason it's famous is it swings. It's a white kind of lower middle class area outside of Detroit. Voted twice for Reagan, voted twice for Clinton, and voted twice for Obama. And in this last election, in the last two elections, voted twice for Trump. So this leads to a big question about the composition and of the two parties. So first thing is just technique-wise, I worry that the Democrats feel they can win without doing the hard organizational work at the local level that the Republicans have done and will continue to do. The second thing is about kind of who's what in what party that I was speaking about before. So remember when Trump ran in 2016, he was one of 17 or 18 Republican primary candidates for president. He really stood out in a bunch of ways, including, at least then, the extent to which he seemed to depart from the, you know, Tea Party, Koch brother, well, more the Koch brothers, super libertarian, business-oriented Republican Party agenda of the establishment. All the other candidates were closer to that than he was. He was the candidate who constantly, you know, he was more populist. He attacked Wall Street constantly. He attacked Silicon Valley. He pledged not to touch Social Security and Medicare. He took those kinds of stances along with the immigrant bashing, racial signaling, and authoritarian stuff. And it was also very gendered toward men. And he beat them all. He, I think, was the only one of the candidates who didn't actually go on bended knee to the Koch brothers. There's now only one, but then there were two, to ask for their support. So, you know, that's mystery number one, or challenge number one, is what does that say about the old Republican establishment that emboldened itself to move way right on economic issues, and for, you know, as Professor Scotchpole said, sort of disabling government as a mechanism to help people. That didn't seem to have much support, and Trump seemed to prove that the real way to rebuild the Republican Party was to go in this very different direction. Then there was the mystery of why did he then go in the direction of a very traditional Republican agenda around big tax cuts and judges from the Federalist Society, which was not what he ran on. And many of the things he ran on, like big infrastructure programs, he didn't do. So the best answer I've gotten to that is that Trumpism didn't have a sort of core of people who could staff a government. The libertarian wing of the party had spent decades building up, you know, think tanks and policy institutes and so on. So Trump gets to office, and all these people can put their agenda right on his desk to be enacted. And the Trumpist agenda just didn't have that. So that's one theory. You know, there's other theories, but it's notable that he zigged one way running and zigged another way governing, at least initially. And this leaves open the question of can these two parts of the party somehow fuse together and find a sort of effective position for that'll allow them to succeed in national elections, if you combine that with, as I said, their proclivity at organizing. On election night at about 11 p.m., the now infamous Senator Josh Hawley from Missouri tweeted, "The Republican Party is now the working class party. That is our future." So you get a mix of these kind of nativist, authoritarian, radical right positions with a hope that the party can appeal to traditionally Democratic or long ago Democratic blue collar voters on both cultural and economic issues. And that leads to the last point I want to make now, which is vulnerabilities of the Democratic Party. The Trump won in 2016, I think partly because the Democratic Party, well, the old days, 100 years ago, if you read like Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis, which is exactly 100 years old, I think, you know, the Republican Party was the party of business and the Democratic Party was the party of labor and immigrants. So that's changed a lot in the last maybe 30 years. And it's not at all clear that the Democrats are the party of business. They're certainly the party of the tech sector, and they're ahead in the financial sector, which are the two most, you know, successful and dominant sectors in the American economy right now. So there's a vulnerability around the very powerful influence of those sectors, at least in the recent decades, in the Clinton administration, the Obama administration, within the Democratic Party, that the party would move in a direction of being super pro free trade and generally insensitive to you know, blue collar people between the coasts. This is racial in part, but not entirely. Note that Trump did better in 2020 than in 2016 among Latino voters and Black voters. These are from low baselines, but the Latino number was pretty high. Most people think over 30%. So I'll close by saying I wouldn't be too confident if I were the Democrats that, demographics are on our side. The Republican Party is way too extreme and apart from public opinion. And so we can just the winds are at our back. I think what the Democrats have to worry about, and I see very positive signs so far in the Biden administration that they're aware of all this more than the past two Democratic administrations. But what they would have to worry about is moving too far away from the labor movement and labor style concerns, seeming too closely attuned culturally and in policy and economic terms to elites, and thinking they can win without having an organizational structure. As one worries about what the Republican Party has become, one should also worry about whether the Democratic Party is going to understand how much work it has to do to meet the challenge. Stop there.
Thank you so much. It's really interesting to listen to you sitting on this side of the pond, because it's a reminder that there is a degree of, I guess, as I'm reading your remarks, confidence amongst certain parts or certain individuals in the Democratic side that history is on their side, or at least the future is on their side, because I think that's not the read on this side of the pond. I think that there isn't a confidence, and there is, as you've seen, I'm sure from watching the news, Europeans are terrified that this is, an exceptional 4 years that we are living in at the moment, and that the return is more likely than not. So I think sometimes one of the many interesting things about your remarks is to get a read on perhaps how it's seen, where you sit, which is where it matters most. I would also say, before I come to Adam Isaacs and David Manning, I do hope that we'll get into a discussion about the role of the state. I know that you've both obviously written reams and books about this. And one of the things that really is remarkable, I think, for those of us, again, watching from the side of the pond, is the sort of disconnect between the dramatically strong public support for the 1.9 package, right, the American Rescue Plan, and yet the deep partisan division in Congress over passing this. And it sort of raises that question of, where is the Republican Party going on with respect to the role of the state? Has the pandemic changed that, or is it, as you suggest, that Trumpist agenda still doesn't actually have real traction in a sustainable way in the Republican Party? But before you respond to that, let me immediately come to Adam and then to David Manning. So Adam Isaacs.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Leslie. I'd like to agree with you, first of all, on both your 2 points. I find the title of this thing very optimistic, and I wish I could share the optimism that we are after Trump. I just don't think so. And also, I think there is a real fear from us, I work in the European Parliament, that this is we have a 4-year grace period, and if we're not careful, things will get worse. This isn't a return to the new normal. The new normal will come back in 2024. We had a reminder in our own politics today, when Viktor Orban's MEPs have left the EPP, the main centre-right party, that things are moving, that people look at these new currents towards a firm leadership or authoritarianism, and they don't go back to how they were. And once the genie's out of the bottle, we can't put it back. My question really revolves around the future for the philosophy of the Republican Party. Will they really go into 2022 and 2024 claiming that the 2020 election was invalid or illegal or stolen or rigged or not legitimate in any way? Is this really going to be the thing that determines them, without going into the further wilder QAnon conspiracies? And one of the things that struck me about the rise of Trump in 2016 was that the left really did not come to terms with the fact that here was someone who was fighting the culture war that they thought they had won, and he was fighting it better. And is this culture war and grievance that CPAC highlighted this weekend, is this going to be the thing that defines the Republican Party going forward, this sense of victimhood, that that big tech and everybody's out to get them and everything's stolen from them? Or will they actually return to something that a conservative might recognize as conservatism, or something that is Republican and committed to democratic with a small d, democratic values going forward? Thank you.
Nicholas, let me come to you, and then when Theta's back, we'll come to her.
Okay. These are big questions and hard to answer. I think on whether the election was stolen, if Trump himself is the nominee in 2024, he's committed to saying the election is stolen. I suspect any other nominee will feel, that they can sort of dial that down a little bit and find ways to appeal to those who think it was, without directly saying that Trump won the election. So that there's a way for that to sort of be in the air around arguing that in 2020 voting was sort of made too easy, and why can't we go back to the good old days when you had to go to the polling place and vote? And that sort of reaches those people. The cultural issues, I think, will continue to be with us. They're very, very, very powerful. And honestly, they're powerful in the Democratic Party too. I live in zip code 10025, which is the postal code that has the highest number of Biden donors of any in America. And people here don't vote. They vote on cultural issues too. They're just on the other side of the culture war. So I don't think a lot of that will go away. Had Jeb Bush been the nominee in 2016 of the Republican Party, and had he won, which maybe would have been impossible, you would have seen a lot less of these thematics. But now they're out there and they're proven to be very potent politically. So I think they'll be there.
I think that the speech that's just been given by former Vice President Pence tells you exactly how the synthesis between elite manipulation of the Electoral College and the Senate system and the Trumpist claim that the presidency was stolen is going to be carried forward. I think we should stop worried about Donald Trump and worry about Trumpism.
I agree.
And he's not going to be the nominee in 2024. He's just going to raise money off that idea and use it to manipulate parts of the Republican Party. But the synthesis is now out there from Mike Pence, the guy who could have lost his life actually on January 6th. And that is that this election had all kinds of voter fraud and all kinds of illegitimate decisions by states to provide modes of balloting and modes of counting the votes. That's going to be used to install a whole new wave of attempts to dilute and block Democratic votes. It's the legislatures and the Congress that we should be looking at, and what those leaders are saying and doing to try to have, try to keep riding the Trumpist tiger. These are elites who overall, including the Koch network, have been willing to ride a tiger that they assumed would not eat them. I interviewed a Koch participating, I believe, a billionaire a couple of years ago, who told me that anti-immigrant stuff and that racist stuff and those tweets that he and his family find so offensive, even as they give millions to Trump and to Trumpist candidates in the party are the price that has to be paid to get the votes that are necessary to install the people that will do almost all the policies they want. And, you know, that's worked. It worked in 2020. The Republican Party did quite well in state legislatures, which will be doing another round of gerrymandering and voter balloting rules. And it did pretty well in the House, which they expect to take again in 2 years. The only place it fell apart is Georgia. And I think Georgia is interesting because that my colleagues and I are beginning to take a close look at Georgia and North Carolina. North Carolina is the state that a Democratic Party elites and donors have assumed would be the first to tip in the upper South, in the changing South. But it was Georgia that turned out to provide Joe Biden's presidency a chance to actually use government in an effective way, which is the one card they've got going for them. And Biden and his people are insisting on policies that speak to the majority of Americans, not to the people who live in Cambridge, Massachusetts and New York who want to, quote, defund the police or talk about getting rid of Abraham Lincoln's name on a public school, which is the kind of thing that just feeds the other side, believe me. Anyway, you know, Georgia was interesting because it was the fruit of a 10-year effort to combine rebuilding the state and local Democratic Party and enrolling new voters and turning out white, Black, Asian, and Latino voters for Stacey Abrams and then for John Ossoff and Reverend Warnock. That is the hopeful scenario where Democrats understand that they have to do the hard, local, personal contacting, grassroots kind of work that is necessary to give them a chance to win close elections. Because Nick is right, the other side, Professor Lehman is right, the other side is not going to lose its profound local roots in church congregations, gun clubs, throughout non-metropolitan America. And rural is not the right word because the contested areas are the outer suburbs and the exurbs of about 6 to 8 key states. They're not going to lose their ability to turn out voters above and beyond their share of the electorate. And the motivation of those voters is very much in line with Trump and Trumpism, because Trumpism did in fact deliver judges that are wanted by both the free marketers and the ones who want to get rid of the government as an actor in the US, and Christian right people and gun people. It's just wrong to say that they didn't get things from Trump. They got things, and that's on top of immigrant exclusion and eviscerating the US refugee resettlement program. So I do think that those folks are going to continue to be a powerful force above and beyond their sheer demographic shares, and particularly in the key states. And the question is whether Democrats can have a muscular, moderate liberalism that doesn't go off the deep end and that deepens the ability to turn out voters at the grassroots. That's what Stacey Abrams did in Georgia. That's what Reverend Barber and his movement did not do in North Carolina.
Let me come to Sir David Manning. I will say that we have a question that's been written in that also asks how significant and how consequential the effort will be over the next several years to disenfranchise Democratic voters, the effort obviously by Republicans. But let me, Sir David, over to you.
Well, thank you for a fascinating discussion. Is there anything left of what one might call the old GOP? How much does it matter that a few people stood up in the House and even fewer in the Senate to oppose Trump from the GOP? And are there any who are brave enough to do it, even though they're not running for re-election, as it were? Or is Biden's hope that he can build at least some kind of bridge to a few Republicans completely doomed? And do you think that the midterm elections matter in this calculation? You've said, both of you, that you expect the GOP to take the House back in 2022. Supposing it didn't, would that give pause to the Republican Party, the Trumpism Republican Party, and perhaps recorrect the course? Or do you think that the old party as we've known it is completely dead?
Who would like to take that first? Nicholas?
Okay, so I'm stopping on completely dead because, you know, everything is always in motion and changing, but there's a book that came out, I think last year or the year before, that I really would recommend on some of these points, called The Never Trumpers, by Tellis and Salden. I don't know if you know that book, Professor Scotchpole, but
Yeah, I read it.
It kind of goes through. It's about the 2016 election. It goes through all the various elements in the Republican establishment, does these long interviews with people in the Republican establishment, and you just leave with the sense that these folks they don't know what hit them, and they have no connection to the process of winning elections at all. So all parties, including the Democratic Party, have some elite versus base, you know, lack of total alignment. But in the 2016 election, it was pretty radical in the Republican Party, and I think that most Republicans are terrified. First of all, party loyalty is very powerful, and most Republicans are just terrified of the base, which they fear and don't get. An interesting case on a couple of these points is Liz Cheney, who's in Trump's crosshairs right now. You know, we haven't talked about foreign policy and all this, but another big Trumpist point was, you know, being against quote unquote forever wars, globalization, opposition to, you know, what we would call neoconservative foreign policy stances. And, you know, there's a question of whether the Democrats will be sort of tempted to go in that direction. That'll open up the possibility of populist Republican opposition. 20 years ago, I remember interviewing the then youthful Liz Cheney. Remember, she's the moderate hope of the party. I was doing a profile for the New Yorker of her father, Dick Cheney. And I said to him, you know, who are his friends he served in the House for so many years. Who are his friends among Democratic politicians? And she did this huge double take. And I said, what's wrong? She said, well, how could you be friends with a Democrat? You know, and I mentioned that because that's 20 years ago, before all this happened. And she's the moderate, super moderate wing of the Republican Party now. So I just don't think there's a lot of give there of people who want to work with President Biden or who feel they can sort of lead the flock of voters that elected them in a more sensible direction.
Thank you. Professor Scotchpole, let me also add a couple of questions in here from the chat before I turn to you. One is, does it matter that Rush Limbaugh died? Is that going to change anything? And the other one is, do the Republicans, this is picking up on one of the points that Nick Lemon made, do the Republicans have even more hope of picking up more minority voters in the years ahead? I mean, is that a sort of, you know, is that going to be a trend? What's the strategy? And then somebody wanted to know whether The Rock, if he ran, would win. It's a great question. I'd love to know the answer.
What party is he in?
I have no idea what the answer to that is, but I can tell you that, of course, they have the possibility of picking up more minority voters, and particularly men, in future years if they block the Democrats from delivering effective governance that matters to ordinary people's lives, and they continue to put out an aggressive message. As for the Never Trumpers, I think it's important to, nobody thinks Liz Cheney is a moderate. So that's something I'm not going to respond to. I think that there's cross-cutting differences in the Republican elite now. There remains the policy-oriented dimensions that Professor Lehman is talking about. But there's a dimension that's come to the fore, which is, do you want to abandon constitutional democracy or not? And that dimension cross-cuts the policy divides in the Republican Party, and that's the bridge that Liz Cheney was not prepared to cross. Some other very conservative on policy questions, Republicans would not cross that bridge, and some moderate Republicans would not cross that bridge. But what most of them have in common is that they're either not running for re-election, or they're probably on their way out. I think Liz Cheney may have trouble surviving a Republican primary in Wyoming in the near future. And I think she is up pretty soon.
Yeah.
Well,
She's in the House, so she has to be up pretty soon.
She showed unusual principled courage in doing something that we should be able to take for granted the leaders of both major political parties in the United States do, which is defend the idea that we're going to not engage in violence and that we're going to respect the results, however rigged within the rules of competitive elections. You know, at the grassroots, when I did my visits to various pro-Trump counties, there would be, I interviewed face-to-face a lot of conservative people, ranging from local Tea Party leaders for whom building the wall, even though they knew it wasn't going to happen, was a very important symbolic priority, to business-oriented Republican people who would always say at the end of the interview when we got to Trump, they would always go through the things they liked about his pro-free market marriage with not traditional elites, but the Koch version of the elites that have moved to the fore of the Republican Party. But then they would always look at me and say, I wish he would stop tweeting. I remember this woman in Ohio who said that to me on both the first and the second interview on two of my visits. And on the second interview, I felt I had enough rapport with her to look at her and say, I don't think that's going to happen. And she looked back and she said, you're probably right. But she's a lifelong Republican. And no matter how distasteful she may find, and even frightening, she may find some of the latest twists of the Trumpist tendencies in her party, which hasn't taken over completely in Ohio. It has taken over in many other states. She will vote for the Republican candidates. And those Republican candidates are going to have to at least pay some verbal obeisance to Trumpism going into the next two elections. So boy, these are viscerally important elections. They're important for the United States and they're important for the world. And the really key question is whether Republicans running in anything but the most extreme districts can put together enough Trumpist-oriented voters who are mainly middle class. They're not mainly working class. I disagree on that. They're not mostly blue-collar people. They are lower middle class people who make decent incomes even if they don't have college credentials. There's a difference there. With suburban pro-business type Republicans who still exist both in the ranks of elected office holders and in a minority, about 20% of the voters of the party. In quite a few House districts and a number of the Senate contests, they will have to put together enough voters from both of those streams and put in place enough measures to frustrate Democrats from voting, which they are working very hard on, to squeak through to victories in the House, perhaps the Senate, And if that happens in 2022, that will hobble the rest of Biden's presidency and do the same thing it did to Barack Obama at the end, which is force him into taking regulatory steps, which puts him into the hands of the most extreme PC type, ultra-liberal urbanites, the advocacy groups around the Democratic Party that want to use regulations, who have a little bit of a non-small d Democratic side to them too. And if you do that, then you set up the 2024 election in a way that will allow yet another round of Trumpism. I don't know if it'll be Trump, and I do think we should wonder whether Trumpism without Trump will work. I can't quite picture Josh Hawley inspiring the kind of fervent love, and that's the correct word for it, that Donald Trump actually does inspire in most of his voting following. It's an incredible thing. It's even when I do face-to-face interviews with people who are of this mindset and this spiritual set, I have a hard time understanding it. But I can tell you it's very real. And I just don't know whether Tom Cotton or Josh Hawley can tap into that same fervent love. And that matters for Donald Trump, above and beyond any policy stand. I don't think he's about policy stands.
Thank you. That was great. I'm going to take a question from, I know we're just going to go just a couple minutes over. We have some tremendous people on the call that have been unusually quiet. So if you want an opportunity to ask your question, we're going to go just a few minutes over, but let me come to my colleague, Hans Kungani, who directs our Europe program here at Chatham House.
Thanks, Leslie. Really interesting discussion, especially on these kind of tensions within, between the different interest groups in the Republican Party. And I have two questions that are related to that. So the first picks up exactly where Professor Lemon left off with Josh Hawley. I'd been thinking about Josh Hawley too. And I guess my question is really about this sort of idea that you mentioned of the Republicans as a working class party. Is that realistic? Is it possible that someone like Josh Hawley really does create a new kind of synthesis between a kind of an economic policy that isn't in the interest of Wall Street and the rich, but actually fulfills some of the rhetoric that Trump had, together with the sort of cultural populism that we've seen? Or does Professor Scotchwell was talking about the donors, do they just stop that happening? Or is that at all possible that Josh Hawley could emerge as that kind of figure? And then secondly, Professor Scotchwell, in your work on the Tea Party, if I remember right, you talk about this fault line between the libertarians and the social conservatives. Does that fault line still matter? And how does that sort of fit in with some of the other sort of fault lines that you've been talking about, that you've both been talking about today?
So let me start with your Josh Hawley question. I actually interviewed him in, 2018, because I was covering the Missouri Senate race where he unseated Claire McCaskill. There's a consensus now, which I think is probably right, that he kind of overplayed his hand in his endorsement of the Capitol rioters and a bunch of other things. He actually didn't poll very well at the CPAC convention. That's not dispositive. And there's a feeling, these cultural signal issues are really interesting. Hawley doesn't come across as, quote, one of us to the kind of people who go to Trump rallies. Trump does. And what one of us means is really hard to parse. It's an intellectual challenge because he's this rich guy from New York. Leaving that aside, though, what I think is worth thinking about with Hawley is, here's the lane for him and some others like Marco Rubio and Cotton and so on, is I'm going to attack the stimulus for not sending big enough checks to ordinary people. I'm going to attack big tech relentlessly and Wall Street secondarily. I'm going to put pictures on Twitter of myself doing evangelical church things constantly. and advocate against globalization and free trade. And in doing that, there's going to be a sort of stance that the Republican Party can go to. I don't think he'd be the person who would take it there, but it's worth thinking about. And I do sense that people in the Biden administration sort of get that this is a vulnerability for them. Example, under slightly mysterious circumstances, an antitrust investigation of Google was killed in the Obama administration. And there was really no airspace between the Obama administration and the tech industry on any issue that I could see. The two antitrust actions against Google and Facebook were initiated by the Trump administration. So I think that the Biden folks seem to understand that they don't want to go out there and say, hey, we're here to defend these great, innovative American companies. So as I said before, it sort of scrambles what's the party of business and what's not. By the way, this mix of racialism and economic populism is an eternal theme in American politics. Remember that the first really meaningful campaign finance reform bill is the Tillman Act, named after Pitchfork Ben Tillman, who even by the standards of the early 20th century was a notorious racist. So, you know, to say the Democrats are a minority party is a natural party of the minorities, and that means that they will both be and be perceived as progressive on economic issues. Don't be so sure. Also, you know, going back to what Professor Skocpol said, you know, the peeled off minority voters who voted for Trump are overwhelmingly male and often have jobs like border patrol guard, policeman, career military, and you know, they feel culturally disrespected by the Democrats. So I think things are very up in the air. I agree that the Republicans will try to suppress votes as much as can possibly be done. But you know, they also appeal to a lot of voters that Democrats think they should appeal to naturally and have a hard time understanding why they don't.
I don't think the Democrats are having a hard time understanding that for the most part. Certainly not the Biden people.
Yeah.
No, there really is, and there has been a remarkable coming together at the presidential level around the idea that you have to deliver bread and butter policies. And I think that's going to hold. I don't see that. In some ways, the fact that the Democrats have only narrow majorities, no majority at all in the Senate, helps that process. There certainly is a complex of progressive advocates and their ties into the media that give outsized importance to a question that I think animates most American voters not at all, which is whether Neera Tanden is the OMB director. Who cares? You know, nobody out there cares. It's just a top issue. But you see the Biden people, they stick with it long enough to look like they're fighting. They understand that looking like you're fighting is important. Donald Trump, by the way, much of his strength comes from portraying that opposite of what Josh Hawley portrays, which is tough guy and I'll never give in and I'm not a loser. Josh Hawley gave a speech at CPAC that was all about how he's being discriminated against. Well, you know, Donald Trump does that well. There's something about his sense of permanent grievance in his own life that resonates with the feelings of a fair number of people out there, particularly men, that they've been dealt a bad hand by all the social and economic changes that are happening in America. But I don't know whether that's reproducible. I just think that much does depend on the Democrats not making mistakes. And I'm not sure about that, but I'm more sure than I was. And I think Joe Biden has shown that he can blend a certain amount of redistributive progressive economics with downplaying some of the cultural extremism that is there in the Democratic Party panoply. Whether they understand how much they have to do to turn out voters in elections where they don't usually turn out is not clear to me. And I think that, and I also don't know what happens if Joe Biden cannot run for re-election. I think that's the 2024 presidential thing that we ought to all be thinking about much more than whether Donald Trump runs again.
Right.
If it's Kamala Harris, I think it'll be possible to replay the scare cards about race and gender yet again.
And also whether, I mean, we assume that if it wasn't Joe Biden, it will be Kamala Harris, but maybe
Might not be
somebody else. But I mean, I think you raise a question that certainly here people wonder about a lot. We've seen in the chat line another comment, which I think resonates across, is a predominant focus in Europe right now and probably other parts of the world about how much Biden has staying power and whether to invest in the foreign policy measures or whether to prepare for a return to Donald Trump or his successor, which obviously has really grave implications on the foreign policy side, as we've seen. I mean, this has been tremendous. I think I continue to wonder how the state will change over the next few years. You talked about the bread and butter issues, and I know that this American Rescue Plan has not been easy to pass with bipartisan support. It's not through yet, but it doesn't look like it's going to have much bipartisan support. But the rest of the agenda, infrastructure, all those things that should have widespread support in the American public, but will they have widespread?
Well, it does have bipartisan support in the sense of people out there in the population who support it. And from before the time he moved into the White House, Biden has been reaching out to mayors and governors on the Republican side. And, he's got plenty of them who want the deliverables in this package. The real test will be that whether they can do another round of big federal spending for infrastructure investments. That will be equally hard, and it'll have to go through with 50 votes. But I don't think you're going to see Biden worrying very much about the congressional Republicans. He knows they're a lost cause. He's going to be reaching out to the subnational Republicans who, frankly, can be bribed. And you should know that the Democrats have returned earmarks to their legislative, and that is a very good thing.
Right.
Because you can compromise over whether somebody gets a bridge in their district a lot better than you can compromise over whether they want to say something about January 6th or not.
Yeah, I mean, that I think is certainly something that everybody will be watching. People, as people are watching America's domestic politics. They always have, but perhaps like never ever before. And the greatest sign of that perhaps was actually not this presidential election, which we would have expected the world to be watching, but the number of events that were held surrounding the midterm elections. 2018 was just phenomenal. I mean, everywhere. And, Brussels, London, Europe, I did find it quite extraordinary when anything that was about Japan was suddenly, if you stuck the US midterm elections as a subheading, you knew that you'd get a tremendous turnout. So I think that's my way of saying that we hope that we know that we will continue the conversation, and we very much hope that both of you will be willing to continue it with us in the months and years ahead, because your knowledge, your depth of knowledge, both practical and conceptual and theoretical and rigorously empirical, is of tremendous value to me, to Hans, to our audiences. So thank you so much for joining us. And thank you to all of you for joining us. Keep well and see you soon.